Angola Prison, the last plantations still operating in America. This video discusses forced labor, extreme conditions, and historical racial injustice. It's intended for educational purposes and to examine the criminal justice system. Viewer discretion is advised. On a scorching June morning in 2024, Chirius Moorhead woke up in a cold sweat. His heart was pounding. In the nightmare, he was back in the fields at Louisiana State Penitentiary. It was dark. An armed guard on horseback loomed above him, ordering him to bend down and pick a vegetable. In the dream, Moorhead said no. The guard shot. But this wasn't just a nightmare born from an overactive imagination. This was the recurring terror of a man who'd spent years being forced to work in fields under armed supervision in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for 2 cents an hour. A man whose daily reality looked so much like slavery that his subconscious couldn't separate past from present, dream from memory. Moorhead's nightmare is part of a federal lawsuit that's currently challenging something most Americans don't know still exists. A prison that operates exactly like a plantation. Same land, same crops, same labor extracted from predominantly black bodies. The only thing that's changed is the year on the calendar. This isn't a story about something that happened long ago. This is happening right now, in 2024, on 18,000 acres of Louisiana soil. And it's all perfectly legal. But to understand how we got here, how slavery never actually ended in America, we need to go back. The Louisiana State Penitentiary sits in West Feliciana Parish, bounded on 3 sides by the Mississippi River. Most people know it by another name, Angola. That name didn't come from nowhere. According to historical records, it was chosen because so many of the enslaved people who worked these cotton fields before the Civil War came from the West African nation of Angola. Before it was a prison, this land was 4 adjacent plantations, Bellevue, Killarney, Loch Lomond, and Angola, acquired by Francis Routh starting in 1827. By 1835, Routh had partnered with Isaac Franklin, a man who'd made an enormous fortune in the interstate slave trade. Franklin consolidated the properties into massive cotton-producing plantations. The land was incredibly productive. By the time of the Civil War, these plantations were churning out over 3,000 bales of cotton annually, all harvested by enslaved people who worked from dawn to dusk, including pregnant women and children during the hottest harvest months. Then came 1865 and the 13th Amendment. Slavery was abolished. Or so the story goes. But here's what most Americans don't know. The 13th Amendment contains an exception. The actual text reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." That clause, "except as a punishment for crime," created a loophole. And Southern states exploited it immediately. Looking back, there were signs no one wanted to notice. After the Civil War ended, Southern states passed black codes, laws specifically designed to criminalize African Americans for minor offenses. Vagrancy, loitering, not having a job. These weren't real crimes. They were excuses. Excuses to arrest black men and women and force them back into labor. By 1880, the widow of Isaac Franklin sold the Angola plantation to Samuel Lawrence James, a former Confederate major who'd secured a lease with Louisiana to house state prisoners in exchange for the profits from their labor. James worked the property with convict labor. He subleased prisoners to private corporations building levees and railroads. According to historical documentation, conditions under James's convict leasing system were sometimes worse than slavery itself. Starvation was routine. Beatings were normal. Annual death rates ranged from 16 to 25%. One plantation owner said it plainly in 1883, "But these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another." The system was so brutal that public outcry eventually forced Louisiana to ban convict leasing in 1898. But here's the twist: they didn't free the prisoners. They didn't shut down the plantation. Everything changed on January 1, 1901. That's when Louisiana purchased the 8,000-acre plantation and established the Louisiana State Penitentiary. The state kept James's son on as plantation manager. The men kept working the fields. Only the paperwork changed. What happened next would define more than a century of human suffering. The prison expanded over the decades, eventually growing to 18,000 acres, larger than Manhattan. The administration ran it like a private fiefdom, according to authors Charles Wolfe and Kip Lornell, who wrote that Angola in the 1930s was probably as close to slavery as any person could come. Guards patrolled on horseback. Prisoners worked the land. Cotton, soybeans, corn, sugarcane, the same cash crops that had enriched slaveholders for generations. During the administration of Governor Huey Long in the 1920s and 1930s, official brutality thrived. Court documents reveal that inmates were underfed, beaten, and tortured. Guard captains later admitted to approximately 10,000 floggings between 1928 and 1940. 10,000. That's not a typo. Prisoners who didn't work fast enough faced the lash. Those who refused faced punishment camps where torture was routine. The brutality didn't stay hidden forever. In 1943, a former Angola prisoner named William Sadler, nicknamed Wooden Ear, after injuries sustained from a guard's attack, published a series of articles called Hell on Angola in the Angolite, the prison's own publication. Sadler exposed the systematic cruelty, the starvation, the violence. But little changed. By 1951, conditions had deteriorated so severely that 31 prisoners took an unthinkable action. They sliced their own Achilles tendons. They crippled themselves deliberately to avoid being sent back to the fields. They believed, correctly, that self-mutilation was preferable to the work they were being forced to do. This wasn't an isolated incident. By May of that year, 55 men had joined what became known as the Heel String Gang. They chose permanent disability over forced labor. Think about that. Imagine being in a situation so desperate, so inhumane, that cutting your own tendons with a razor blade seems like the better option. What they did to survive would shock even hardened criminals who'd seen everything behind bars. But this was their story. This was their only way out. Public inquiries happened. Reforms were promised. Federal courts eventually got involved. In 1968, 4 Angola prisoners filed suit against the state, arguing that conditions violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In 1975, a federal judge agreed. He declared conditions at Angola unconstitutional and prohibited the prison from accepting new inmates until the population declined. He ordered improvements to security, medical care, and food service. He demanded the state eliminate fire, sanitation, and health hazards. He ordered desegregation. Some changes occurred. The most overt tortures ended. The lash disappeared. But what happened next would change everything, or rather, what didn't change. Because while the methods evolved, the fundamental system remained. Armed guards still rode horses. Predominantly black men still worked fields. The plantation never stopped operating. Fast forward to 2023. By then, Angola had become America's largest maximum security prison, housing 6,300 prisoners. 74% were black, despite African Americans making up only 32% of Louisiana's population. The majority of correctional officers were white, referred to not as guards, but as freemen, a term that carries obvious historical weight. The farm line, that's what they call the agricultural work detail, operates with ruthless efficiency. According to court documents filed in September 2023, every person incarcerated at Angola is required to work the farm line at some point. For the first 3 years of their sentence, they work for free. Zero compensation. After 3 years, they might earn between 2 and 40 cents per hour. 2 cents. For backbreaking labor in Louisiana heat that regularly exceeds 100 degrees. The work itself hasn't changed much since the plantation days. Men harvest vegetables by hand, okra, tomatoes, potatoes, corn, hot peppers. They pick cotton. They hoe rows under the supervision of armed guards on horseback. They work in fields with limited access to water. No restroom facilities. Minimal rest. They're told when to start, when to stop, what to pick, how fast to move. If they refuse, they face solitary confinement. If they don't work fast enough, punishment follows. Lamont Gross, one of the plaintiffs in the current federal lawsuit, described what he witnessed. I saw guys collapse. There were dudes that got heat stroke. There were dudes with underlying conditions, older or had some sort of disability, but they had to go out there, too, When someone collapsed from heat exhaustion, the others kept working. Nothing stopped for a fallen man. Nothing except when a guard's horse went down in the heat. Terrence Wynn, who entered Angola as a teenager and has since become an advocate, testified before a U.S. Senate committee in May 2024. According to his prepared remarks, if a man fell over, we kept working. If you got injured, you kept working. Nothing took precedent over going to work. He described guards using racist language, calling grown men boy, making threats about hanging. These weren't isolated incidents. Multiple plaintiffs reported the same degrading treatment in court filings from October 2024. Police said the work was necessary for prison operations. But witnesses claimed something different. According to the lawsuit filed by Voice of the Experienced and Incarcerated Plaintiffs, much of the farm line work serves no legitimate penological purpose. Men were forced to dig holes and then refill them. They picked individual blades of grass by hand. The work wasn't about rehabilitation or even productivity. It was about control. About breaking men. About ensuring submission. Court documents paint a picture of systematic cruelty masked as corrections policy. The heat index often exceeded 113 degrees, the threshold at which the National Weather Service issues excessive heat warnings. Yet men worked anyway, often without sunscreen, without adequate shade, without reasonable breaks. They wore inadequate clothing and lacked proper protective equipment. Some were taking medications that affected their body's ability to regulate temperature, but they were sent to the fields regardless. What evidence they uncovered would shock even veteran detectives familiar with prison conditions. When a federal judge reviewed sick call records in 2024, he confirmed that men sent to the fields without restrictions had serious health conditions. The state's own temperature logs from May to October 2023 showed 145 days when heat alerts should have been issued according to their own policies, yet work continued. The investigation revealed something far more sinister than simple negligence. This was systematic, deliberate. An independent expert hired by the court found that Angola's heat-related policies were irrational and featured glaring deficiencies. U.S. District Judge Brian Jackson wrote that prisoners on the farm line faced substantial risk of injury or death. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Advocates called it modern-day slavery. Prison reform organizations pointed out that the same land, same crops, and predominantly black labor force created an unbroken line from antebellum slavery through convict leasing to present-day mass incarceration. But Louisiana Department of Corrections attorneys argued that stopping farm line work would deprive thousands of prisoners of fresh vegetables and would cost the state over $8 million annually in lost revenue. Judge Jackson challenged that figure, questioning its validity. If officials had provided adequate water, shade, rest breaks, and sunscreen, basic protections that OSHA requires for free agricultural workers, many of the harms could have been prevented. But there's a catch. OSHA regulations don't typically cover prisoners. The protections that apply to every other outdoor worker in America don't apply to incarcerated people. Because of that exception clause in the 13th Amendment. But the story doesn't end there. Life at Angola stretches far beyond the farm line, though for many prisoners, those fields define their existence. The daily reality is one of complete institutional control. You wake when they tell you. You work where they tell you. You eat what they give you. You're surrounded by reminders that you are, in the eyes of the state, property to be used. The psychological impact runs deep. Charius Moorhead's recurring nightmares aren't unusual. Multiple plaintiffs in the federal lawsuit described similar trauma: waking in cold sweats, panic attacks triggered by heat, persistent fear even in their cells. When you spend years believing that refusal means death, that belief doesn't vanish just because you're back inside. For some prisoners, the work creates a form of learned helplessness. You learn not to complain, because complaints mean solitary. You learn not to refuse, because refusal means punishment. You learn not to collapse, because collapsing is seen as malingering. You watch other men fall and keep your head down, keep moving, keep working. It's a survival tactic passed down from those who came before, advice whispered in cell blocks late at night. Keep your head down, do the work, maybe you'll make it out alive. but some refuse to accept that survival means submission. Since the 1970s, prisoners have organized for change, often at tremendous personal risk. The most famous were the Angola Three: Albert Woodfix, Herman Wallace, and Robert Hillary King. They formed what many consider the first official chapter of the Black Panther Party behind prison walls. For their organizing, Woodfix and Wallace spent more than 40 years in solitary confinement, the longest documented period in U.S. history. 40 years. In a cell barely larger than a parking space. King also spent decades in solitary. Their crime? Demanding basic human dignity. The relationships inside Angola mirror the power dynamics of the plantation era. There are trustees, prisoners given slightly better jobs and minor authority in exchange for compliance. There are those who work in offices or factories, considered fortunate compared to field workers. There's a brutal hierarchy that correctional administrators exploit, just as slaveholders once distinguished between house slaves and field slaves. The punishments echo antebellum discipline, solitary confinement, known as the box or the hole, and the denial of family contact through restricted calls and visits. For many incarcerated at Angola, the death sentence is implicit even if it was never handed down in court. Louisiana has some of the longest prison sentences in America. Many men enter knowing they'll likely die there. The prison even has its own cemetery where indigent prisoners are buried when families can't afford to claim bodies. They call it Point Lookout. Guards and prisoners alike refer to Angola as the farm, but they also call it the last stop. The ongoing legal battles represent a fragile hope. But progress is slow and uncertain. The state fights every reform. They argue that agricultural work is essential to prison operations, that harvested food feeds prisoners, that the work provides structure and reduces idleness. But advocacy groups counter that the work could be voluntary, could be properly compensated, could be conducted with basic safety protections. The question isn't whether prisoners should work. It's whether they can be forced to work under threat of punishment in conditions that risk their lives. For those with families outside, the impact extends beyond prison walls. Janice Parker, who frequently visits her paralyzed son at Angola, has witnessed the failing medical care firsthand. Laws recently passed under Governor Jeff Landry threaten to strain the system further by lengthening sentences and limiting early release options. Families watch their loved ones disappear into a system that treats them as disposable labor rather than human beings worthy of dignity. Some men maintain hope through education, religious study, or creative pursuits. The Angolite, the prison magazine, continues to publish, giving prisoners a rare platform to document their experiences. Some participate in the Angola Rodeo, a controversial event where prisoners compete in dangerous events for small purses while crowds cheer. Critics call it gladiatorial, another form of exploitation. Supporters argue it gives prisoners rare opportunities to earn money and interact with the outside world. After decades of litigation and reform attempts, something unexpected happened. In June 2024, federal Judge Brian Jackson took action that surprised advocates and officials alike. The emergency motion filed in May 2024 asked for something simple: stop forcing men to work when the heat index exceeds 88 degrees. That's it. Not end the farm line entirely, just protect human life during extreme heat. The number 88 wasn't arbitrary. It's the threshold where heat-related illness risk increases substantially, especially for those with medical conditions or taking certain medications. On June 24, 2024, Judge Jackson issued a temporary restraining order. He didn't grant everything the plaintiffs requested, but he acknowledged what Louisiana officials had denied for years. Prisoners on the farm line faced substantial risk of injury or death. He ordered state officials to immediately rectify the glaring deficiencies in their heat-related policies. He gave them 7 days to submit a plan providing adequate shade and rest, sunscreen and protective supplies, revised heat pathology medication lists, and procedures to protect field workers with health conditions. Jackson's order explicitly addressed climate change, noting that extreme heat events are becoming more frequent and severe. The prison's own temperature logs confirmed that heat was a regular threat, not an occasional problem. Jackson wrote that, Injunctive relief is required to preserve and protect human health and safety, especially as the summer heat arrives in full force. The ruling was narrow but significant. It didn't end forced labor. It didn't challenge the 13th Amendment exception. But it established that even convicted criminals retain some protection from conditions that threaten their lives. For the first time in Angola's history, a federal judge had acknowledged that the state's treatment of farm line workers violated basic constitutional standards. But by 2025, that temporary restraining order had expired. In March, attorneys for the plaintiffs filed a new motion asking for reinstated protections as another scorching Louisiana summer approached. They argued that without court oversight, the state would return to its old practices. Louisiana officials opposed the motion, claiming reforms were too far-reaching and that stopping farm line work during high heat would create severe financial consequences. The lawsuit seeking class certification remains pending as of late 2024. If granted, it could apply to everyone at Angola who might be assigned to the farm line, potentially thousands of men. State attorneys oppose class certification, arguing that conditions vary too much between individual workers. A trial date, originally set for September 2024, has been put on hold. Meanwhile, new evidence continues emerging. Court filings from October 2024 include dozens of declarations from current prisoners describing guards using racist language, making degrading comments, invoking threats with historical resonance. One prisoner described a guard saying, "You're going to work or you're going to hang." Others reported being called boy repeatedly, a term freighted with centuries of racial subordination. The broader movement is gaining momentum. Angola isn't alone. Similar lawsuits challenge forced labor in Alabama, where the state passed a constitutional amendment banning slavery in 2022 but, according to a lawsuit filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights, continues compelling incarcerated people to work under threat of punishment. Texas prisoners describe similar conditions, working farms on former plantation land, facing brutal heat, receiving little or no pay. At the federal level, Senator Jeff Merkley has introduced the Abolition Amendment, a joint resolution to amend the U.S. Constitution by removing the exception clause from the 13th Amendment. The resolution would prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, closing the loophole that's existed for over 150 years. But as of December 2024, the resolution remains in committee. Constitutional amendments require ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures, a monumental political challenge. Terrence Wynn, the formerly incarcerated advocate, now travels internationally speaking about prison labor. He's testified before Congress. He's appeared in documentaries. He's become a voice for those still trapped inside. But even he maintains cautious optimism about the lawsuit's prospects. He knows Louisiana's politics. He knows how resistant the system is to change. For the men still inside, the immediate future remains uncertain. The farm line continues operating. Men still work in extreme heat, though some informal improvements have been made in response to litigation. Water breaks are slightly more frequent. Heat alerts are occasionally heeded. But these changes exist at the discretion of wardens and can disappear the moment court attention fades. Where are the key players now? Judge Brian Jackson remains on the case, weighing arguments about class certification and permanent relief. Lydia Wright and her colleagues at the Promise of Justice Initiative continue representing prisoners, building evidence, filing motions. State attorneys defend Louisiana's practices, arguing that forced labor serves legitimate penological purposes and that reforms would be too costly. And Chadarius Moorhead? He's still incarcerated at Angola. He still has the nightmares. He's still hoping that when summer arrives, the protections will return. That maybe this time, things will be different. That maybe his willingness to put his name on a federal lawsuit, to risk retaliation by prison officials, will mean something for the hundreds of men who'll work those fields after him. To this day, no one knows how this lawsuit will ultimately be decided. No one can predict whether Angola will still be operating fields with forced labor in 5 years, 10 years, a generation from now. The legal questions are complex. The political resistance is fierce. The financial incentives favor the status quo. What we do know is this: the system that created Angola, the ideology that views certain human beings as inherently less deserving of dignity, the belief that punishment can justify any condition, the willingness to profit from suffering, that system didn't end with the Civil War. It evolved. It adapted. It found new forms that look different on paper but feel the same in practice. This case reveals something profound about American society. Our relationship with slavery never truly ended. We changed the paperwork. We updated the language. We told ourselves a story about progress and redemption. But we kept the plantation. We kept the fields. We kept the system of forced labor. We just moved it behind walls where most Americans would never have to see it. The 13th Amendment is taught in schools as the amendment that freed the slaves. Children memorize the first clause, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist," and skip right past the exception. Most Americans, according to a recent poll, have no idea that slavery remains legal as punishment for crime. They don't know that roughly 1.2 million incarcerated people can be and often are legally enslaved. They don't know that 5 states still pay nothing for most prison jobs. They don't know that men and women are forced to work under threat of solitary confinement, family separation, and violence. This isn't ancient history. This isn't something we can relegate to dusty textbooks and museum exhibits. Angola Prison is operating right now, today, as you watch this video. Men are in those fields. Guards are on horses. The cotton is being harvested. The system continues. The lessons here aren't simple. This isn't a story with clear heroes and villains, though the systemic injustice is undeniable. It's a story about how institutions perpetuate themselves across generations. How legal language can be weaponized. How suffering can be normalized when it happens to people we've been taught to view as less than human. How the same land can be used for the same purpose by the same racial group for nearly 200 years, and we call it justice because a judge signed the paperwork. Currently, Angola remains the largest maximum security prison in America. Approximately 6,300 men are incarcerated there. Most are black. Most will likely die inside those walls. Many work the fields for pennies or for nothing. The federal lawsuit continues its slow progress through the courts. Advocacy organizations push for reform. Some legislators champion the abolition amendment. But meaningful change remains elusive. The final fate of this case, of Angola itself, remains uncertain. Will courts finally declare that forced agricultural labor in extreme heat constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? Will Louisiana reform its policies voluntarily? Will the 13th Amendment's exception clause ever be removed? Or will Angola continue operating as it has for over a century, a plantation masquerading as a prison, a living monument to America's original sin? Here's one last haunting detail. In the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., there's an exhibit about Angola. It features an actual guard tower from the prison, one of the first artifacts to arrive at the museum. In fact, the tower was so large it had to be installed before the museum's walls were built. They literally constructed the building around this symbol of incarceration. The guard tower sits in an exhibit called Defending Freedom, Defining Freedom, Era of Segregation 1876 to 1978. But the dates are misleading. Angola didn't close in 1978. The tower was removed only for display purposes. The prison, and what it represents, continues. Think about that. We built a national museum to commemorate African American history and culture, and we built it around a piece of a still operating plantation prison. The symbol became a museum piece while the reality it symbolizes continues unchanged, just miles away from tourists photographing history they believe is past. The question we're left with is this: can a society that profits from the forced labor of its most marginalized citizens, that extracts wealth from suffering, that maintains plantations in all but name, truly call itself free? Can we claim to have abolished slavery when it remains legal under our highest law? Can we talk about justice when the descendants of enslaved people are still working the same fields their ancestors worked, just with different terminology? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're challenges to our legal system, to our values, to our understanding of who we are as a nation. This channel covers the cases the system wants you to forget, the injustices that persist because they're hidden, the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about how power operates. Angola isn't an aberration. It's not a relic. It's a feature of American incarceration, one example among many. Next week, I'm examining another case that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about criminal justice. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The men at Angola, Arias Moorhead, Lamont Gross, Terrence Wynn, and hundreds of others, they're not asking for special treatment. They're not demanding luxury. They're asking for basic human dignity. Shade when it's 115 degrees. Water when they're dehydrated. Sunscreen to prevent cancer. The right to refuse life-threatening work without being thrown in solitary confinement. The recognition that they're still human beings, regardless of what they've been convicted of. Is that really too much to ask? Do you think justice has been served at Angola, or does the system perpetuate slavery under a different name? Comment below. What would you do if you were forced to choose between working in life-threatening conditions or facing solitary confinement? Be honest. And which part of this case shocked you most? The fact that it's still happening, the minimal compensation, or that most Americans have no idea this exception exists in the Constitution? The fight over Angola isn't finished. The lawsuit continues. The summer will come again. The heat will return. And men will face that same impossible choice: submit or suffer. Until we confront the truth about what we've built and what we continue to maintain, that choice will remain. The plantation endures. The question is how long we'll let it.